Right, I can see the numbers slowing down now. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Rachel McCabe, and I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers here in London. I'm also the chair of Doughty Street's Wellbeing Committee, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all this evening to this important discussion about vicarious trauma and burnout in the legal profession. I'm also delighted to wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day. And I'm, of course, wearing a green blouse because that is a rule for Irish people on St. Patrick's Day. So, just before I introduce our guests this evening, a few points of housekeeping. The first is that this event is being recorded, and it will be available on Doughty Street's website within the next few days. I'd ask you please to bear that in mind when you're asking questions. We're intending for this to be a general discussion about vicarious trauma and burnout and how to address those issues. So we're not intending this to be a forum to discuss your very personal stories of vicarious trauma this evening. So the intention is that I'll be in conversation with Rachel and Joanna for about 40 minutes or so, and that will leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions. And feel free, of course, to ask your questions throughout in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I'll be picking them up at the end. So let me introduce our wonderful guests. We have Rachel Francis. She's a barrister at One Pump Court Chambers in London. Rachel specialises in family law and immigration law and the intersection between both of those. We also have Joanna Fleck, and Joanna is a consultant, teacher and writer working across a range of projects at the intersection of mental health, physical health and social justice. Joanna is also a former solicitor, and she specialised in inquest law and actions against the police. So Joanna and Rachel are the co-founders of an organisation called Claiming Space, which is a social enterprise we'll hear more about shortly. And they've also written this book, Vicarious Trauma in the Legal Profession, a practical guide to trauma, burnout and collective care. As you'll see, my copy is well worn already. I would encourage you all to buy the book. It's only £18, and the code for 20% discount will be emailed to you after the event. It's less than 200 pages. It won't take you long to read, and I promise you, you will learn an awful lot from this brilliant book. I should say it's published by Legal Action Group, who are co-hosting this event with us this evening. Now, just before I get started, the authors, Joanna and Rachel, have made clear in the book, and I want to reiterate that we readily accept that legal aid and social justice law is an extraordinarily humbling field to work in. However, the privilege of undertaking this work must not be used as a catch-all to smother practitioner experience of vicarious trauma, burnout, stress, or otherwise. We all recognise that the work that we undertake can be relentlessly tough and desperately upsetting, and that it can and does leave a mark on us as human beings. But the freedom and permission to discuss the impact of our work, we say, is critical to our survival in the profession and, of course, to the proper and safe service of our clients' best interests. That's why Joanna and Rachel have written this book, and that's why we're having this conversation this evening. So with that context in mind, I'm going to start my discussion with Rachel and Joanna. And I'm going to start by asking, what in broad terms is vicarious trauma? Joanna.
Okay. So the way we talk about vicarious trauma, kind of with Claiming Space and also in the book, uses a model that kind of splits it a little bit. So in the first instance, vicarious trauma, we think is a really useful term to simply describe the fact that we're exposed to trauma through our work. So every day for some people, maybe not every day for others, we read about, we watch CCTV, we hear the testimony and stories of our clients. We hear about trauma that's not happening directly to us, but we are exposed to it. And if we can just use that as a phrase to just describe a fact of the work, that's kind of the first way we describe it. So that takes away our intention would be for that to be a term that doesn't describe necessarily vicarious trauma being always a negative influence, a negative effect on us. It covers a range of processes and effects on us that can range from the incredible, just as you've already touched upon, how incredibly humbling and what a privilege the work can be, being alongside people who've survived really the worst of other humans or situations or discrimination, and yet are thriving and are fighting these cases sometimes for years. And we can gain incredible strength from their strength just by walking alongside them in that way. But it also covers the fact that some days that effect isn't there, and it's more a case of feeling burnt out, feeling like you can't care anymore. Excuse me, I've been talking all day. And in the kind of most acute situations, it may even leave us feeling our bodies reacting as if we were experiencing the trauma ourselves. So something sometimes is called vicarious trauma, but you might call secondary traumatic stress. It might even be classed as post-traumatic stress disorder in certain circumstances. So we think it's a really helpful broad umbrella term just to describe the fact of what we're exposed to, as well as to kind of cover the range of those effects too.
Yes, and the book makes clear that you're aiming to demystify really the term vicarious trauma, and as you say, for it to be used commonplace, just to describe our experiences as legal aid lawyers working with vulnerable people at the coalface, effectively. So there's a description of burnout by a solicitor in the book, and I should say the book contains a number of very, very powerful anonymous case studies from solicitors, barristers, paralegals. And there's a description of burnout by a solicitor in the book that I'm sure will ring true for many of us this evening. And the description is, I've had some moments where I do think my workload is unachievable. Those are the almost at breaking point burnout moments. It's often when I've got loads of competing deadlines, you do kind of feel like you're drowning. Very familiar to me, and I'm sure many others. So you've touched on it briefly there, Joanna, but can any of you describe the link between vicarious trauma and burnout?
I think what Joanna was saying is really right. In the first instance, vicarious trauma is purely a term of description. It's a neutral term that describes the fact that we are vicariously exposed to trauma through our work every day. But I suppose what link we try to draw between the concepts of vicarious trauma and burnout is that the repeat exposure to that trauma vicariously, often in a very proximate way, because particularly for solicitors, you inhabit the client in order to draft a compelling witness statement or to craft pleadings, if you're a barrister, that have particular weight and gravity and lend themselves to oral submissions in court. And doing that in a repeat way with severely traumatizing material or material that catches you in whatever way can cumulatively build up this load that just becomes unmanageable. And in any of kind of a variety of different senses, you don't have the resources to meet the demand. Some people might say, that's being a legal aid lawyer. We never have the resources to meet demands because clients don't come to you with a kind of clean, sanitized, I have this small problem in this small box. If you can solve this, then everything else is going to be great. It's like a massive, Laura James describes it as life on a plate. But I think the tension and the difficulty can be particularly where you've got this highly traumatic, high level caseload. It has this kind of attrition effect on all of your resources. And that can have those negative effects that Joanna was describing earlier on from the neutral form of exposure to trauma.
Yes, and again, you describe it in the book sometimes as compassion fatigue. where the empathy that we display for our clients does begin to wear us down, especially with heavy caseloads, which we all have. So tell us a little bit about Claiming Space then, which is the organization you co-founded. And there will be people here this evening, I'm sure, who don't know what it is. So what is it and what led you to set it up?
So Rachel and I met on the committee of young legal aid lawyers. And some time after I'd left, Rachel was the co-chair. I was in a position where I was reconsidering my career path really. And I was kind of moving away from working in law full time. And I don't really remember why, but I just sent an email to Rachel and Ollie, the co-chairs, while I was like, I just thought, it feels like too many people are burning out of the profession. It just feels, it feels like there must be something that we can do. And I'm really interested in doing something about it. What about you guys? And Rachel, I'm sure that would have just remained a kind of vague thought in my mind, but luckily I spoke to Rachel and she was like, great, yeah, let's do something about it. Let's meet up, let's do something. And we had lots of conversations early on about the importance, I think we thought, of something needed to happen straight away. This wasn't necessarily a kind of big, something we could kind of hold off on or do too much research on. We just thought there is obviously the need. We've experienced it ourselves and we've seen it in our colleagues. So we kind of started with different levels of how we wanted to approach it. Our first idea was just a place where people could come together and talk about their experience, which became our peer support sessions, which have been running monthly ever since, now on Zoom. And a kind of second level was thinking about how we could improve the education and awareness of the issue. And so that was like a kind of our medium term aim, which we've been doing for a few years too. But ultimately our kind of top aim is to create a profession-wide change. So along with the other people who are doing work in this area, so law care and freedom from torture, and many others doing kind of work in small ways in their own firms and their own chambers. That was kind of our long-term ambition.
A very noble aim. And so what led you from Claiming Space to writing this book?
It's a really interesting question, and I would be interested to know what Joanna thought. But after our kind of serendipitous beginning, where I was like chewing Ollie's ear off about, we need to do something, everybody's leaving the profession, this is outrageous, and Joanna being like, we need to do something, this is outrageous, and then Claiming Space blooming out of that. I think we got to a stage where we felt that the information that we wanted people to have about vicarious trauma, burnout, self-care, collective care and trauma, we needed a dispersal mechanism that would come into contact with more people. And we tried to kind of think, what will people want in terms of like looking at these commodities? And we thought people would want an explanation of what those terms are, would want information about where that's landing in the profession, and hence we did all of the interviews with the anonymous persons who were quoted in the book to kind of lend their experience to each of those themes and their experience of how that lands, and a practical guide, something that people could use and implement into their individual practice, into their team or organization, to start from a kind of like grassroots level of information and acknowledgement of these issues, and to build them up into some positive and substantive change. And we felt that a book would have reach, and it would also kind of give credence to these issues, and it needed to be well evidenced because it was addressed to lawyers. That was really our kind of like mission intent, if you like, with the book, I think.
And it is well evidenced, and it is extremely accessible, I would say. It's very digestible, and I think anyone in the profession could pick it up and read it in a couple of afternoons and will learn a lot from it. So there's a barrister's description of stress in the book, which again rang true for me, and I imagine will ring true for others who are here tonight. And that is the quote, "I'd be making my way to court and I wouldn't want to arrive at court. I just would have this urge of not wanting to arrive at court. I got off the train once a couple of stops early. I just got off and sat on the platform, and then I got on the next train." And that's a clear description of someone who's feeling very stressed, probably burning out. So what are some of the other signs of burnout for those of us who aren't so aware of them?
I mean, I think they one of the difficulties with any of this stuff is that they arise really differently in different people, because we've all learnt our own particular ways of coping with stress, and some of those ways are really helpful and some of them are perhaps not so helpful in the long term. But I think we're thinking about burnout and maybe compassion fatigue. It's that feeling of the way I describe it, because maybe just from my own personal experiences, it's like a kettle when it reaches boiling point, and it just kind of switches off, and there's that feeling of, it can be maybe a numb feeling. It's often very physical, so I think that's one of the ways that we sometimes miss it, because our brains kind of keep going. We keep doing the work, we keep churning out the billable hours, but physically we'll start to notice the signs, particularly, you know, the classic example where you haven't taken any leave for a really long time, and then when you do, you're ill for most of it. And then you have your 2 days of enjoyment at the end. But I think what's really key is for people to get to know their own signs.
Yeah.
So for some people that might be really physical. For some people it might be definitely not speaking from experience, but you might be very irritable with your loved ones and have a very short fuse, which other people might pick up on. So I think it's more a case of kind of getting to know your own signs, which is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the signs you mentioned in the book is feelings of resentment or cynicism towards the job. And interestingly, in the last few weeks, I've had 2 separate conversations with instructing solicitors of mine who shared separately that they were feeling exhausted from working from home in particular, and not having taken a proper holiday because we haven't really had the opportunity to. And they both separately said they were feeling resentful before their work, and it was something they hadn't experienced before, and they knew that that was a sign to take some time off. And they both then did separately take a week off and came back with renewed vigor for the job. So admirable of them to have recognized that as a trigger, and it's certainly one of my own features of burnout. So some lawyers today who are here today might think vicarious trauma doesn't affect them or their practice area. I think particularly a lot of lawyers might think it's only linked to immigration and asylum law. But what would you say to those lawyers?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is to go back to your first question, Mary Rachel, which is about what does vicarious trauma mean? And all it means in the first instance is that neutral form of exposure. It's really kind of a matter of so many dynamic factors in your practice, in your life, as to how that lands, and whether you experience the kind of the joy of the vicarious resilience of kind of standing alongside clients, or you get some of the more pernicious and negative effects of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, or any, a kind of shift in your worldview to the idea that it's actually really a pretty dark place to live, rather than, a generally benign place where sometimes dark things happen. So it's certainly something that we're all exposed to if we're doing legal aid and social welfare law. And the sooner that's accepted, the sooner we can start to have honest conversations. And I mean, if you think about some of the things that happen in not immigration and asylum law, they are so horrific, children being removed from their parents, or children being physically harmed in any variety of ways, people losing the security of their homes, people dying in custody. There's so many different manifestations, and different factions of the profession kind of have different approaches to their work. But, there are negative events in every single aspect of social justice and legal aid law. It would be, improper of us to say otherwise. So everyone's got the kind of that exposure, and it will land differently over time for different people and different personalities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah, of course.
I'd like to think there are plenty of people in the profession who have been able to manage these things really well. And for those people, I think, I'd really hope they would be part of the conversation, because if they have good practice and good systems where they work, then they're people we need to hear from. But without disbelieving people who do feel that way. I'm just thinking of the times we've done trainings where it's often people at the senior end of the profession who come to the training and they're like, well, I'm just here for I'm worried about the junior staff. I'm fine, I'm worried about them. And by the end of the training, they've either kind of confessed or like opened up mid-training about something, or they come to us at the end and say, I don't think I quite realized how much I'd bottled up and how much I'd buried. And like, this has really shaken me. And now I realize that I have something to look at as well. It's not just for my staff. So
absolutely. So the more we have the conversation, the more people might realize the impact, and then they can start to take steps to address the impact rather than bottling it up. So a feature of the book was guilt and feeling like one is not doing enough. Again, I'm revealing a lot about myself in this discussion, heavily relatable. There's a case study from a paralegal, which was very powerful. And they say it's so hard to have a good work-life balance when you work in civil liberties and human rights areas. You almost feel like you have to be fighting every battle there is out there. You're trying to fight the battle with work. Then you go on Twitter and there are 10 more things to be upset and enraged about. And so you're trying to deal with all of those things too. And that's, of course, particularly true of the last week's events. So is that something that came up a lot in your research, this feeling of guilt? And how can we address these feelings of guilt?
I mean, it came up a lot, and it's come up in almost, I mean, I think there's probably not been a peer support session or a training session where it hasn't come up in some way or another. I mean, the first thing to say is that doing the interviews for the book and training people has been just an extraordinary process. You know, people being so honest and open with us has been at some points absolutely terrifying, the kind of the scale of this issue in the profession, but also heartening in a way that people are prepared to have these conversations and query what impact lockdown has had, because I think that's opened people up a bit in many respects, or kind of brought them to an edge that they can't kind of contain anymore. But certainly in terms of guilt, as the quote that you read out at the beginning, Mary Rachel, is just such a, you know, I was like, that is a good summary, an apt summary of it, because it just can really shut the door on the conversation, because people feel disempowered by their levels of guilt, such that they think, you know, I mean, if I compare my life to the client that I'm dealing with, the client that I'm serving, there's just no comparison. And, you know, how can I ever have done enough for this person? Because they've still got this and they've still got that. And if, as sometimes happens, senior practitioners are handing down this view that it's a privilege and you should be grateful for working here, then you feel guilty for even having the emotion in the first place. And obviously saying that out loud can have kind of a guilt complex for the person who's saying it as well, denying their own experience of it. So it can have a really pernicious effect, for sure. I'm sure Joanna will have things to add, because we've had a lot of conversations about this as a theme, because it's really difficult.
Yeah, again, I presume in terms of addressing it, it's a matter of talking about it, raising awareness about it in discussions like this, so that we start to realize that it is pernicious and it's valid to feel some level of burnout and trauma, and to find coping mechanisms for that, rather than just trying to push through all the time, and to, you know, to stop and take a break. Joanna, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I forgot.
Don't worry.
Oh, actually, sorry, I do. I think lots of us will have some experience of working with clients who have a PTSD diagnosis, and may have even, you know, worked with experts about that diagnosis. And guilt is one of those things that people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress feel. And from an outside view, we can see how our clients surviving, you know, torture when others haven't, or surviving an abuse situation, or not having done enough. We can see from the outside how not only unfair that is on themselves, and also how unhelpful it is for their recovery. And I hope we would be able to kind of give some of that same compassion to ourselves, that guilt is so understandable, but it's also a really unhelpful emotion. If you follow that guilty voice, you don't help yourself, you're not really going to help your clients more. It's a real really toxic influence.
Yeah, I agree. It is a negative and unhelpful emotion. But one reason for guilt, I'm sure, is that overwork in our profession is praised and rewarded. And there's often an expectation on barristers in particular to be available and to work evenings and weekends. And so is burnout inevitable in a culture like that?
Gosh, I hope it's not inevitable, because otherwise the 123 attendees who are present are going to be like, right, that's it, I'm leaving the Zoom. But I mean, we've got to change the way that people talk about this job and the way that we value ourselves within it, because we are doing enough by being practitioners in this field, full stop, end of story. And by having the bravery and the courage to work against state injustices and to assist people through legal processes that are often unfair and racist and unlawful and just really, really bloody tough, to be honest with you. So all of that is good enough. And so I think it's really about changing the way that we frame it, and what we kind of give people praise and heroism for. You know, you're not a hero if you're working till midnight every night and then you burn out and you can't support any clients. You know, Joanna and I often talk about, like, not the client right now, the client that's coming to you in 3 years' time. You want to be there for them as well, because this country, this government, the policies that we're working with, they're not getting any better. And everybody who signed up here today is going to be such a valuable resource for vulnerable clients in the future, because there's going to be many more of them. I saw a really interesting comment actually just on the theme of guilt that I wanted to acknowledge, from Oliver, which is just about the tension and the kind of difficulty. I think they talked about, like, the Venn diagram of guilt, which is that sometimes you just feel like, you know, what the hell can I do about any of this? And so I think any protective steps that you can take to sort of be like, this is what I am doing, kind of reframing it, are positive, because lawyers are doing extraordinary things every day, even the small things, by listening to clients and bearing witness to their stories. And that has to be praised and acknowledged.
Yeah, and acknowledging and praising someone for drawing a boundary, perhaps, and saying, no, I'm not going to work this weekend. Not necessarily because I have plans, but I need to rest and recover, and that being respected and acknowledged as a positive step to take for their well-being, rather than judged or criticized for that. So I think that there's a theme arising that we need a cultural shift in the profession. And there's another striking quote from a paralegal in the book, which says, law is still such an old-fashioned profession. It's still dominated by white middle-class men. But with a new generation of lawyers, there can be a shift. But it won't happen unless we start talking about this and start changing the culture. No more stiff upper lip. I thought that was a brilliant quote. And just to say that, Rachel, you and I both spoke on an event last year for junior lawyers and well-being. It was hosted at Doughty Street, and it was organized by 3 excellent paralegals who are now gone on to do brilliant things, trainee solicitors and pupil barristers. But they were 3 women who organized that. It was predominantly women who spoke on the panel. We're all women this evening, and most of the attendees, I've looked at the list, are women. So just taking that point about law being dominated by white middle-class men, and it seemingly being mainly women having this discussion, how can we get more men to become a part of this conversation? Tricky, I know, as women, to answer that.
I think it maybe speaks to something a bit wider. I'm just like, I think I'm dodging the question. But well, firstly, it may speak to the fact that there's still the historic imbalance that actually at the junior end there are more women, and that might be the people who are more affected and more open to change than some people at the top of the profession. And I say that knowing there are people at the very top of the profession who are absolutely committed to making really genuine change. So I think it may be a little bit of that, and it may be also it could be helpful. I think it speaks to a wider issue just about diversity in the legal profession generally, because, you know, Rachel and I have written this holding kind of significant amounts of privilege and haven't experienced much of the discrimination and actually the primary trauma of working in a racist justice system, not just the vicarious trauma of working with the trauma of racism in our cases. And I wonder whether part of why we wrote the book is to try and kind of give some kind of open up the conversation elsewhere. And I think the more diverse voices that we have talking about this can only help, because we talk from our experience, from the research and evidence that there is, and kind of a little bit from what we hear, you know, day by day over the last few years. But actually, it's really powerful to hear from people directly. And I think the more different voices and different experiences that we can hear from, that might help people hear something more of themselves in that. And that may help. I don't know. I think men have to do what works for them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really difficult. This is an issue for everyone, and it's an issue that affects everybody. And it's really difficult for us to say why these events have more women attendees. There's been a comment from somebody who wants to kind of make clear that this is an issue that affects women and men in a kind of very pernicious way, and we recognise that. And it may just be about visibility, people who want to be visible at these kind of events rather than not. It may be the balance of women versus men in particular areas of the profession. It may also be that women come to traumatic caseloads with a greater likelihood of experiencing intersectional trauma themselves, whether it's through discrimination or intersexual racism and misogyny, and therefore these kind of issues catch them in a way that maybe they don't more regularly with men. But there's also a huge conversation outside of this about the way that women and men engage in meaningful conversations about things that need to change, and that's been really brought to the fore by the murder of Sarah Everard. And there's also a separate conversation about the way that men do or don't speak about their own mental well-being and suicide. So I think it would be inappropriate for us to couch it in any particular way. What we want to make really clear with the book is that this is an issue that has the possibility of affecting everybody. So everyone is welcome in this conversation, and we want everybody to be talking about it. And we want to kind of give everybody the grace and the humanity to feel like they can be listened to and held, because this isn't something that affects a proportion of the population rather than another. It affects everybody, and we have to be clear that that's the truth.
Yeah.
I hope people feel welcome here this evening.
I hope they do. I hope they do, and I hope more men will continue to join the conversation. Joanna, you were going to say something else?
Yeah, I just also wanted to kind of make clear too that we spoke to men for the book. It may not be clear, you know, it's not necessarily clear from each of the passages who that, you know, we tried to keep them as anonymous as possible, but men gave really powerful evidence to us for the book, and our training and our peer support. Men do show up, and they do talk really honestly about their struggles. So I think the idea that them, you know, possibly being less visible, I don't think means that they're not only not affected, but also not reflecting on it and not willing to be engaged and do the work, because they what they share is just as powerful and meaningful as anyone else in these groups.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. Just I need to give a shout out now, because there was a quote, no more stiff upper lip, and I do just want to recommend a blog called stiffupperlipblog.com, which is written by a junior barrister, Malvika Jagan Mohan, who's done fantastic campaigning work in this area, and she's also on Twitter. So that's stiffupperlipblog.com. So moving on now to, I think we've discussed the problem, as it were, and I want to talk a bit more about the solution. And you've said already, and it's really emphasized in the book, that the first and critical step is awareness. And I completely agree. And again, there was a brilliant quote from a solicitor in the book, which says, I think it's incredibly important that firms understand that people have different propensities to stress and burnout and vicarious trauma, acknowledging that it's an individual situation and not just thinking that overall people can cope, shifting from this mentality that it is weak to speak out if you're not coping. Just never a truer word spoken. So hopefully there are practice managers here this evening. I understand some of my clerking team are here this evening, and there are lots of solicitors and barristers here this evening. What can practice managers be doing in their firms and chambers, first of all, to raise awareness of these issues?
Well, I think in the first instance, holding events like this and publicising these themes as a very real part of our work is a key step forward, because the more that people have the language to describe the impact of this work, the more they will have the freedom to kind of couch it in their own words and to truly reflect what their lived experience is of being a practitioner in this area. So I think provision of information to whoever's in your organisation is absolutely key. And there's all sorts of resources, one of which is the book. Got to do a little plug.
Yeah.
There we go.
Another plug.
I hope Best is watching. And that's a really important step. And then, you know, Joanna and I felt very strongly at the beginning of setting up Claiming Space that the first thing we needed to do was to provide a space, literally, and an opportunity for people to discuss how their practice lands and what the impact is, and to learn from each other and share and reflect on that. So setting up kind of like formal peer support spaces can be really helpful. Encouraging buddying or mentoring schemes within your workplace is a huge thing as well. Even things about, like, you know, how you set up an office space. Do people have closed doors or open doors? Do they work, if they're kind of on kind of frontline services like telephone lines, are they proximate to another person so that they don't have to walk across a room to go and see somebody if they're distressed by a call? Now that we're all working from home, that's really difficult. But, you know, are there Teams lines of communication on Teams or WhatsApp connecting people so that they can explore the difficulties of work? You know, really bringing practitioners together can be very helpful as well to unify that kind of feeling of how this work lands.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it slightly different for barristers' chambers then, with the different structure and everyone being self-employed? Do you think it's more challenging in that environment to raise awareness and or implement change?
I'm going to pitch in here, even though I'm not the barrister. Because I was just thinking about one of the things we've drawn on throughout the work of Claiming Space and in the book is drawing on other professions who are kind of doing more to address this, just as part of their, you know, the way that people train and qualify. And, you know, people like lots of psychotherapists or counsellors will be self-employed. That's quite a, you know, that's a common way of being employed, or just doing kind of agency work or whatever, and without that clear structure. But for them, well, for most of them, I mean, you'd hope it's a fundamental principle that they get support to process what they're hearing every day, and it's just a given that that's what they do, and they fit it into their structure. So I think very easy for me to say, but I just don't think there should be an excuse because people are self-employed. It should just be such a necessity that we have some way, whatever works for that person, but some way of processing what we hear. Because, you know, I think I imagine that many people who are here on this at this event will have someone who comes to mind who has really struggled with it, whether it's themselves or someone that they've worked with, who you know, the consequences can be really extreme. People can really, really suffer.
Yeah. And do you think there's any responsibility on senior lawyers in the profession to lead by example and show a good example to junior lawyers, their trainees, etc.?
I think so, definitely. And I think modelling good practice is always beneficial, both for the kind of practitioner, because they get the benefit of their own good practice, but equally to show people that there are kind of effective, boundaried ways of doing this job that give you longevity in the profession. and it's never too late to change. You know, there's definitely been a lot of conversations that Joanna and I have had over the years with senior practitioners who say, I wish this had been a conversation when I started out, and it just wasn't. I was totally shut down, and I still feel shut out by other practitioners who were kind of parallel to me in terms of my level. And like, I can't talk openly about this. And that's really sad, and has to change. But we believe that it can change, and anybody can start taking those steps to kind of implement good practice over time. And it has a kind of a holistically positive effect. And unfortunately, there is no quick fix. You know, there are going to be difficult cases and difficult weeks and long weeks and dynamics in our family and personal lives, which will make it really hard to do this work. But if we kind of practice over time the boundaries and, you know, the better parts of kind of managing the load of this work, then that will give us strength over time, we hope. But yeah, it really is a practice, I think.
Yeah, I wrote an article in Council magazine a couple of years ago about these issues, and I think Shan has shared it in the chat. But when I was preparing for that article, I read previous articles, and a senior QC in the profession, Joe Delahunty QC, had said that senior members of the profession need to lead by example and need to enable juniors to say no when they're at their limits, so they don't feel pressured to say yes, even when they're at the point of burnout. And I think that's a really important message for senior members of the profession to be sending out. You know, even if they worked a bit too hard and continue to do so, they're empowering and enabling juniors to not do the same, essentially. But I want to talk briefly about self-care. It's certainly a sales tool for consumerism, and I know lots of people think of self-care and they think of a bubble bath or a holiday. But your definition of self-care in the book is self-care is about creating and maintaining effective and appropriate boundaries. Boundaries, obviously, a word that's come up quite a lot this evening. And the book, it opens with Audre Lorde's powerful proclamation: caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So what do you say to those of us who struggle to draw and indeed maintain appropriate boundaries?
I mean, I think Audrey says it all with that quote, doesn't she, really? You know, if any of us needed to kind of align self-care with our kind of our values and why we do this work, then Audrey's captured it in a phrase, and that's why we wanted the book to start with that. But Joanna, other than me praising Audrey, I don't know if there's anything more specific that you wanted to add.
Yeah, it's hard to just be, I mean, no one can possibly be more eloquent than her. But I think we were really clear in the book not to just give, it wasn't something that we wanted to give like a list of tips for, because what kind of restores and reinvigorates each of us is going to be different. So there's no prescriptive list, but I think it's that sense of, if it's something you struggle with, and it may be linked into that feelings of guilt, it may be linked into the messages that we're getting from other people in the profession, that sense of, oh, this is a privilege and it's not, you know, it's barely even a job, it's just such a joy to and an honor to do this work. I think if those are messages that you're struggling with, or there's just, you know, all you see is the kind of Gwyneth Paltrow version of self-care, which is a bit, you know, all kinds of problematic. Having that sense of it being, you know, you're fueling yourself for the future battles. I mean, I believe you should take care of yourself to feel good, and it's good to feel good, and you are allowed to feel joy and pleasure, and that's a right. But yeah, it's also a sense of fueling ourselves against, you know, whatever. The people with resources on the other side of our battles are taking care of themselves. Like, we know they are taking care of themselves, so we better take care of ourselves too, because the fight is going to be long. You know, there's not, without being too pessimistic, I think at one point in the book we kind of hint at the things that are looming on the horizon, the impact of things yet to be felt, whatever the fallout of the pandemic is and the government decides to do with austerity, or you know, treatment of migrants, the climate crisis. We've got to fuel ourselves.
Yeah,
they're taking care of themselves. We have to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in the Council magazine article that I wrote last year, I said exactly that, which is there are aspects of our job that aren't going away. You know, our vulnerable clients aren't going away, nor are the low legal aid fees, for example, or the unreasonable court deadlines. There are lots of stressful and challenging aspects of our jobs that won't go away, but to enable us to be able to do the job and manage those challenging aspects, we need to have enough sleep at night and time off at the weekends to replenish our stocks. And for me, it's not just about having a holiday 3 times a year and thinking that will fix you. It's not about working to burnout and then having a holiday to replenish. It's about constantly replenishing in, you know, most evenings and at the weekends. And obviously recognizing that sometimes that's not going to happen because there will be urgent deadlines. But at least if most of the time you have a precious boundary, then the job is much more manageable and sustainable. And you've both argued that very powerfully in the book. I'm going to move now just to the Q&A. We've got a few questions here. So there's one from Legal Action Group, which says, young lawyers will be presented with many situations they're not equipped to deal with. How can they do their job in obtaining information while showing empathy, but not horror at what they are hearing? Surely there should be training in how to speak to clients about their trauma, how to react/not react. This sense of not being up to the job must be a huge factor in stress, and some formal preparation as part of training would help. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this came up an awful lot in the interviews that we did for the book and has come up through the training over time. The pressure and the stress, as the question identifies, that is placed upon young practitioners, or indeed any practitioner, of feeling ill-equipped to deal with a scenario with a traumatized client, and the risk of you being negatively impacted by that exchange definitely escalates and gets much more significant and potentially severe through lack of preparation. I mean, Joanna and I are really clear that we believe there needs to be a paradigm shift towards trauma-informed working, and that has to be a two-directional approach. One in one direction, and we spoke about this at the book launch, one direction is to say that in order to be able to kind of greet the trauma that a client is presenting in whatever way, on paper, CCTV, or sitting in your office, or in court with you, or on the phone, you have to have an understanding of how that's going to land with you, and have the ability and the kind of resources to put in place boundaries and look after yourself. So the kind of self-reflexive trauma-informed working. But equally, there should be training, mandatory training, in as part of legal courses or qualifications, or when you are inducted into an organization, for how to take traumatic statements and information from clients without re-traumatizing them. We sometimes talk about this thing, and it's mentioned in the book as well, this emotional currency that you have with a client. It's the way that you build a system of empathy and understanding with them to be able to take instructions on some of the most egregious things that can happen to human beings in the world, ever. And if you are not supported to do that with proper training and boundaries and kind of a collective attitudes towards your care in the workplace, then you risk being marked in a way that is indelible or very hard to shift. And so, yeah, it's so important. That training is absolutely needed, but it's definitely a two-directional one, that we would say.
Yeah.
And specifically, if that's something that people are concerned about, there is, just off the top of my head, the Law Society in Scotland have got some really good resources about trauma-informed working from that second point of view of how to, I think it's specifically about how to take evidence from a client who's in a lot of distress. But I think it's really, really helpful.
Scotland leading the way again. They've just implemented the UNCRC this week as well. So there's an interesting question here, which is, do you have any recommendations on dealing with anger towards senior members of chambers who refuse to respect boundaries around time and well-being? It's certainly a prevalent issue in the profession, certainly at the bar. Do you have any thoughts on that, dealing with the anger that you feel when someone doesn't respect your boundaries?
I think it's really, really tricky, and it's you know, a very, could be, some people who are on this Zoom may feel that it's kind of quite a personal characterization. I mean, it really lands and resonates with me an awful lot, because when you were talking earlier on about resentment, often my feelings of resentment are attached to what I'm required to do as a result of the actions of other people, whether that be, you know, usually something that the court has required me to do, a bit lastminute.com. But I suppose it's about channeling it, isn't it? Because I think that anger can be actually a very valuable emotion, depending on what is done with it. And I suppose some careful planning about what the message is that you want to communicate, and then kind of putting that in a format that you can deliver to someone that encourages them to make the change. And this person may be thinking, that's absolutely rubbish. I can't package my anger in a box. If I did that, it would explode like a bomb. So if that's how they're feeling, then I apologize. But I think it's like trying to translate it into action, because anger and fury can be really useful to kind of drive you to achieve change. And so sort of packaging it into something that you can then take as an ask to a senior member in terms of what it is that they're doing wrong, and what it is that they're not balancing could be useful.
I do think as well there is probably a role for clerks to play in that particular dynamic. If a senior member of chambers is repeatedly not respecting the boundaries that you're trying to draw, and bear in mind that the power dynamic in a junior leader situation, it's pretty difficult for a junior to draw a hard boundary with a leader. I think there is probably a role for clerks to play there potentially, in having a word with perhaps problematic leaders who consistently don't respect those boundaries and force their juniors to work at the weekends, for example, routinely. But sorry, Joanna, you were going to say something.
Yeah, there was another question a little bit down that asked whether we have any tips on how to bring these things up with seniors when you're the most junior person in the office. Yeah. And it felt like maybe a similar thing. And the only thing I can really add is that just from our experience, there will be allies. You know, if you feel that way, you are almost, I guess unless you're in a tiny organization, which maybe makes things a little bit trickier, there are almost always people who felt the same way, people who've been in your shoes just a couple of years before, who've moved up the ladder. And I'd kind of, however you're able to do that, finding allies to band together, because it's unfortunately very easy for firms to ignore one person and see that person as expendable at the junior end of the profession, because they think, well, we'll just recruit another paralegal. But hearing from they can't, okay, they may ignore, but they shouldn't ignore a systemic problem. And often, I mean, it almost certainly these things are. It's the same. It's trying to be diplomatic here, but there are organisations where it is known that there are one or two people who make the firm or the organisation a lot of money, and so nothing is really done about that treatment. But if people can kind of group together, I don't know, like I'm guessing I'm saying like join a union. That's the other thing you can do.
Yes, you can. And there is a trade union for legal professionals now, Legal Sector Workers United, of which I'm a member, and I would encourage in particular junior members of the profession to join. Paralegals especially could really benefit from the trade union. And just on this theme, there's another comment, which is senior practitioners can be the cause of the problem. Some appear to sleep no more than 4 hours a night, such as their workaholism and or the pressure upon them. Fair enough. Chambers need policies, not bubble bath, to discourage this and to prevent senior practitioners from expecting it of juniors. I agree. And just by way of a suggestion of good practice, actually at Doughty Street recently, we had a leader junior roundtable meeting where we discussed good practice for leaders and good practice for juniors in a sort of roundtable informal format. And we've produced a leader junior best practice guide, how to be a good leader, how to be a good junior. And the how to be a good leader really does focus on respecting juniors' boundaries and respecting private time and not placing unreasonable demands for urgent work, etc. And that is our best practice guide, and we hope that on the whole it will be followed, albeit of course there are going to be some members of the profession who don't follow it, and perhaps their behavior needs to be addressed in a different way. You know, a policy is all well and good, but unfortunately at the bar in particular, it's quite difficult to force people to follow those policies. I'm not sure if I think most of the questions have been answered. There's one final question that I'll ask before wrapping up, and that is, what is the best way to build resilience?
I really love that question. Joanna and I have quite an antagonistic relationship towards resilience, because it's often one of those words that's used in a pejorative, like if you don't have resilience, or you're not coping, and so can be kind of loaded with judgment. But I think from our experience, the best way to build resilience is practice and routine, because the more that you can regularize the commitment to yourself and your value and the care that you deserve and the joy that you deserve, alongside being an exceptional practitioner, the easier it is to replicate those behaviors in the darkest and most difficult points of your practice. Because that reference that you made earlier on, Mary Rachel, to Professor Joe Delahunty QC's comments is a very valid one, but people are very poor at enforcing their boundaries when they are at their limit. So because they are at their limit and they're shredded and have experienced all the attrition effects that have brought them to their limit. And so if you're able to practice over time, you stop yourself from getting to the limit, and you have the knowledge that you survived that situation before, and that gives you resilience over time. Certainly, you know, my life has been changed by having clinical supervision and being forced to implement certain things that I do at points in the day to kind of help bring me down from this task, fight, flight scenario that we often are occupying all the time. And if I didn't do that regularly, I think I'd probably go completely mad. But it is a practice. So I think practice is the key.
Yeah, and just on this clinical supervision point, there's one other question. I said the last one would be the last one, but this will be the last one. And that question is, I wondered if Rachel and Joanna had seen any successful well-being or mental health support already embedded in legal aid firms. I know you've both been doing training in firms. Have you seen a successful model already in operation anywhere? I think work in progress, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there's definitely no one size fits all approach, but we do know of firms and organisations that are taking it really seriously and doing what is proportionate for their organisation. So something like providing a space for peer support and a facilitator for peer support. I mean, I think we've said many times in other situations that the gold standard is having proper external supervision. But even I think those firms where they're actually meeting their current supervision targets, you know, would be maybe a good start. But it is possible. I think when enough people take it seriously and understand the financial risk that they're taking by having a load of burnt out paralegals and junior lawyers doing their casework, I mean, just that kind of very baseline level of the risk of cases going wrong and files not being billed properly and not getting in all the money that you're meant to be earning, the investment that you put into this surely would pay off. But I think there's definitely good practice, and particularly individuals who are doing really good work as supervisors. Yeah, I think that's probably fair, Rachel.
Yeah, I think there's lots and lots of firms and law centres that are doing brilliant work, and it's kind of bringing it all together and collectivising it. And that's what we've tried to say in the book. The value is particularly weighty when it's a kind of a collective one and a collective care approach. And sharing all of those ideas in peer support spaces or training spaces is hugely valuable and a great source of kind of resilience and strength to all of us, because we all want to work in this profession for the benefit of clients and, you know, ourselves now and into the future. So definitely there are lots of positive things happening, we would say.
Brilliant. Well, I think we'll end on that note. I'm certainly feeling very inspired and hopeful after this discussion this evening that the tide is turning. the fact that Rachel and Joanna have written this book and that so many of you came to this discussion this evening is proof, I think, if you needed it, that you're not alone in experiencing these feelings. And it is something that you should feel able to share with your colleagues and your peers, so that we can bring about some change, some positive change in the profession. But we're already well on our way, I think. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining this evening. Thank you, Rachel and Joanna, for joining us. But more importantly, thank you for writing this book. Please do buy the book. You will be emailed your 20% discount code after the event this evening, and it's only £18 anyway. And once you've read it, please share it with your colleagues. Please lend it to the paralegals in your firm, etc., etc. We'd encourage all of you to read it, spread the word. And thank you very much, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.